80% of the translators who worked with LSPs cited low rates of pay as the leading challenge, whereas for respondents who worked with direct clients, they said that higher rates of pay was a key benefit.
We try to prepare our students. We have simulated projects where we challenge them as sort of pretend clients to practice their negotiation skills.
And welcome everyone to Slater Pod. Today joining us are Joseph Lambert and Callum Walker, who are lecturers in translation study at Cardiff and the University of Leeds, respectively. Hi, Joseph. Hi, Callum.
Hi, Florian.
Hi there.
Gentlemen, where does this podcast find you today?
So I'm in Cardiff today, waiting for the rain to join us.
And I'm in the East Midlands in a little town called Newark-on-Trent, which is kind of near Nottingham, for those that might know it.
Got it. Yeah, I think all of Europe is waiting for the rain to set in. I think we have a bit of rain tomorrow, so by the time this comes out, maybe the drought will be over. But today we're going to talk about an equally important topic, rate setting for freelance translators. So you recently published an amazing 30-page report titled, great title, Because We're Worth It. And then the subtitle is Disentangling Freelance Translation Status and Rate Setting in the United Kingdom. But cliffhanger, before we dive into this super interesting topic, just please tell us a bit more about your background, your decision to work in translation studies, and also kind of your history as freelance translators. Maybe we start with you, Joseph.
Yeah, of course. So I originally did a BA in French and Italian, and I loved doing translation, but at the end of my BA, I kind of thought I don't really know what translation involves that much. So I went back, as many people do, and I did an MA in translation studies. With the intention of working as a freelancer, and I did go on to work as a freelancer from French and Italian to English, mainly in sports translation, doing a bit of social media as well. Um, but I also, when I did my MA, I fell in love with translation studies, the academic discipline. So a few years after starting as a freelancer, I had the opportunity to do my PhD in translation studies, and kind of since then, I've gradually phased out my actual translation work and gone into the academic side of teaching translation at UK universities. So I love both the practical side, the theoretical side, um, and unfortunately, I do relatively little actual translating now. But in terms of research, my specialism is translation ethics properly. But along with Callum, I'm very interested in what we're calling translation industry studies now. So really trying to foreground that link between how translation actually happens, then what we're talking about in universities, so the theory and the practice.
Callum, tell us a bit more about your background.
Yeah, so I came out of a languages degree with studying French and Russian, and went into freelancing back in 2009, I think it was. So I used to specialize predominantly in legal and business translation, and I set up a small translation business, which I still run on a very small level to this day. Like Joseph, I just took an interest in the discipline, started my academic journey in 2012 part-time alongside my freelance work. Um, did my PhD. It was on more of a sort of blue skies project, I guess you might call it, but now I've started to turn my attention back to some more industry focused research, so translation industry studies, as Joseph just said, and in particular project management and elements of sort of the economics of translation.
Got it. So if I just start with that question right off the bat, like what are the top 3 challenges for translators when it comes to pricing their services?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer. I think, first of all, knowing what to charge is a really big challenge. So you can find some guidance on things like Prosy relatively easily, say this is the typical rate in this language, in this domain. But how much you should charge on a case-by-case basis and, based on your own personal situation is really tricky to figure out. So factors such as, the domain you're working in, the deadlines that you're working to, text format, all these factors feed into it. And I think actually knowing how to calculate these rates is a big challenge for translators. Um, the second, and this is another big one, is kind of client or LSP resistance to the rates that you're asking for as well. I'm sure we'll get into this in more detail shortly, but clients are often presented with this image of machine translation that looks great, and so it's quite hard to justify the need for professional translation, or it's they don't often understand what goes into a professional translation as well. And we've all seen those LSP emails, dear linguist, what is your best rate as well. So there's this sort of downward pressure. Um, yeah, again, we'll talk about this later, but I think on that side as well, there's kind of a blockage in terms of charging the rates that you want to or that you deserve potentially. And the final one that I think is a big challenge is actually being willing to talk about rates as well. So it's still a massive taboo in so many places, and in the UK, we don't talk about money very much, and that's definitely true in the translation industry. And there was a really good uh, survey of freelance translators in the UK a couple of years ago by Inbox Translation, and this was one of the big sources behind our research actually, and it's something that we're still kind of working on a little bit. And one of the final questions was, what is one thing that would improve your quality as a freelance translator? And one of the comments was, I want to know what other translators charge, so I have more confidence to push for a pay rise with my clients. So I think that's really indicative of this inability to talk about these things, which again, I'm sure we'll come back to later. So they would be the three challenges for me.
Callum, anything to add to that, or?
Well, what I was going to say is that when we were preparing for this, we came up with our own respective answers to that question, and we both came up with pretty much the same answers. So actually, Joseph's covered it perfectly already.
So let's talk about the piece of research you published, which triggered a discussion. Great title, Because We're Worth It. What was the motivation to write this piece of research? Who do you think is your primary audience? And just maybe tell us a little bit about the genesis of the paper.
Okay, so it's an academic article which we've just had published in the journal Translation Spaces. So really our aim was to try and explore pricing in the translation industry and try and look at income for translators and try to understand really why it's so problematic for a lot of freelancers, and especially those that are quite new to the profession. So it's involved trying to explore the status quo, trying to look at why things are the way that they are, and then unpacking the factors that contribute to this situation for many freelancers and how they sort of intersect with one another. So it is aimed at an academic audience in the sense that it's published in an academic journal. And there's a palpable irony here, which we actually do touch upon briefly in the article, that we're writing this in an academic forum to try and effect change in the industry. So there's a bit of tension, but what we're trying to do, and this podcast is a perfect example of this, is trying to use it as a springboard to engage better with the industry, to bridge those gaps between academia and industry. And we hope that these themes will sort of resonate with practicing translators. And by the way, anyone that actually wants to read the article, do get in touch with us and we're happy to share it.
Yeah, and I think I'd just add there that one of the motivations was just a shared interest in translation rates. Personally, based on our experience as freelancers, but also this growing interest based on our teaching in universities, where students are always asking about translation rates. How much should I charge? How much can I charge as well? And unfortunately, as we found out, a lot of that information isn't provided either on courses or in existing literature. And unfortunately, all the answers, or rather the answers that are out there, aren't always what the students want to hear as well. So that's why this question of, how can we change the situation came to the forefront as well.
What I found interesting and also a bit like, I don't know, not depressing, but tough to swallow, was that you mentioned status or low status of the translation profession as kind of one of the central issues, kind of holding prices down. Like, how do you see that status issue generally, and like, what do you think? I mean, it's a huge question, but what do you think could be done to change this? And why are you very why do you think it is that you perceive it, or one perceives it, as a low status profession?
To address the change question first, very briefly, I think this is something that unfortunately is going to be very hard to change, especially when we're dealing with effectively economic forces. So for me, one of the big factors here is education. And unfortunately, this is a generalization, of course, there are a lot of people that simply misunderstand what translation is. they misunderstand the complexity of translation, and that includes what qualities and competences it actually takes to be a so-called good translator, and how much actual learning and experience goes into making it to that kind of level. I mean, LSPs can do some here to protect translators. They can try to help the clients understand that translation is not just a production line. There's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of knowledge that goes into producing, or rather delivering, a translation service. When you buy translation services, it's not just about a tangible product. It's a service, it's a consultancy, it's advice on the type of translation you might need, when translation is or is not appropriate even, and plenty of other things that you might not have even considered. But because a lot of clients see it as something very tangible, here's my translation, now I've got it as a document or a piece of paper, this oversimplifies what the industry does. This in turn affects the status of these professionals. And this is a bit of a vicious cycle. If you have low status, it tends to give rise to lower rates. If you charge lower rates, it then reinforces the low status. Joseph, was there anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of points we could add. It's obviously such a complex area. There's this question of regulation as well, or the lack thereof. So basically, if you say you're a translator in the UK, at least you are a translator. So that feeds into this question of low status. But another sort of interesting idea that we've come across and that we explored a little bit was this idea of translators not being really business minded or business like. I think they've been criticized for being economically unambitious by some scholars. And it's a bit of a generalization. I know some translators who are really switched on that side of things. But at the same time, I do know freelancers who just kind of want to get on with their creative work and they're not really willing, able, or bothered about negotiating on that side. So I think that that's potentially another factor, although it sits below the things that Callum was talking about before.
Translators have to be a lot of things. They have to be subject matter, like domain experts. They have to be linguists, and language experts, and then they have to be, like solopreneurs, basically. So it's asking a lot, which should help kind of elevate the status if you succeed on all these metrics, right? From a personal experience, like when how much could you draw on like your personal experience as freelancers or doing freelance work when it comes to rate settings, and did that inform your article?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when working as a freelancer, rates were pretty much a constant battle. A lot of the time there was just very little room to negotiate with rates. It's kind of the agency or the client will say, "This is what we're offering. You either accept it or you leave it." And if you leave it, often there'll be someone else willing to take it as well. So there was this kind of sense, and particularly when you're starting out as a translator as well, you kind of think you've got this choice between either I don't work or I work for less than I want to, and so I think it becomes a really complex area. Um, and that was, yeah, like we were saying before, that was something that really sat behind why we're interested in this area, based on personal experience and just the sort of feedback that we're getting from other emerging translators as well. Callum, I imagine it's similar for you.
Yeah, I mean, exactly the same thing. They're regularly asked to work at low or lower rates than what I would have wanted to charge, and frequently sort of being forced into negotiations on various levels. And this is something we try to prepare our students for as well. We have simulated projects where we get them to negotiate rates. We challenge them as sort of pretend clients to practice their negotiation skills. But touching upon something Joseph just said, it's sort of a prisoner's dilemma in some ways. Even if you yourself reject the low rates, there'll be someone who will accept it. And that's no criticism of them necessarily. It is, unfortunately, as a freelancer, it's quite a precarious profession. So sometimes people just have to accept those rates. If you've gone a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks with no work at all, a big job comes in with a lower rate, who are we to blame them for taking it on? Because you just can't go for long periods with no work at all. The problem, though, is that this creates the impression that the rate's then acceptable, and then this perpetuates itself. So it's again a very vicious cycle that's very hard to break.
Have you looked into kind of the differences between working with end clients, direct end clients, versus working with language service providers? And what was the conclusion there?
I think from personal experience, and I'm sure it's similar for Callum, we've spoken about this before, there's a difference in rates. So it was kind of 20 to 30% higher with direct clients in my experience. And this seems to be something that is kind of supported by the relatively few statistics that are out there. So going back to that inbox translation survey that I mentioned earlier, there was a figure that I think we cited in the paper saying that I think it was like 80% of the translators, there were about 1,500 freelancers who worked with LSPs, cited low rates of pay as the leading challenge, whereas for respondents who worked with direct clients, they said that higher rates of pay was a key benefit. So there seems to be this clear demarcation between what the two sides, direct client versus LSP or agency are offering.
The counterpoint I'd like to point out here is that we're very keen not to paint the LSPs as the bad guys here, because LSPs play a really important role in the industry, and it's never our intention to try and undermine that. And I think as well, it's very logical to understand why there has to be a margin there, because obviously they're an intermediary, so they have costs of their own. But they do lots of things for the freelancers as well. So they invest a lot of money in marketing so that the freelancers don't have to. They have to cover those costs somehow. They bear the financial and other risks of very complicated projects so that freelancers don't have to. They, of course, have large overheads, including project manager wages in most cases. And also they do some of that consultancy work on behalf of freelancers so that the freelancers can focus on doing what they do best. So a good LSP is worth its weight in gold. There is a very, very tiny number that are unfortunately exploitative. Fortunately, I'd like to think that it's quite a small number, but they do exist.
And they don't typically, my personal experience, they don't succeed long term because, I mean, work gets around. Freelancers are like, well, I'm not going to work with these guys again. They pay late, they don't pay, etc. Right? Pay low rates. So hopefully, yeah, the market would take care of that as well from the translator side.
You'd hope so, and I think there was an article just a couple of days ago in the Guardian about the rates being paid to interpreters by a company based in Europe, and so these cases are getting publicized sometimes. I think some of them do slip through the net, but hopefully there's a bit more pushback. This is something we touched upon in the article a little bit, Callum, I think as well. Just there are certain cases where we're seeing LSPs actually champion translators and say, actually that's not enough money, or we need to raise our prices of things as well. So fingers crossed there's some hope out there. It's not all doom and gloom, which I hope we're not painting a really negative picture of things so far.
And just to echo the point as well about I suppose the self-regulatory nature of the market, in that the translation profession is quite a nice community. So like you say, word does get around. Some of the unscrupulous practices are weeded out quite quickly because there are things like the Blue Board on ProZ or ProZ, depending on how you want to say it, and other forums like that where bad practices are shared very quickly, and like you say, they just can't continue to exist. So there is good experience of these sorts of things being shut down, so to speak.
Now, looking back a couple of decades, let's take the long arch of history. What were some of the key disruptors to the translation profession that freelancers had to contend with over the past couple of decades that you came across in your paper?
As a point of terminology, I think the word disruptor often has bad press in that it has a positive connotation as well as negatives. So, but I think most obviously, everyone will say it's technology, of course, is one of the biggest things that's changed. So machine translation has developed at a rapid pace. Neural machine translation, of course, is reaching the stage where it's achieving functional quality in a lot of domains, in a lot of language pairs. It's free and it's instant, in using the publicly available engines at least. So to the general user, without the expert knowledge that a translator has, it's now actually starting to appear as if it's competing with professional translation. This then leads into some of the effects for working conditions here, where we're seeing practices such as post-editing, which is now very, very common. This does have an impact on income, which I think we'll touch upon in a little while, perhaps. And it also has an impact on job satisfaction. Another thing that's just starting to sort of be picked up in the literature, in translation studies and in industry publications, is the role of the platform economy, so Uberization, as you might call it. So this is another forum where rates are starting to be see competition, and there are different forms of procurement starting to take place. And the other effect that this is having is it's now starting to blur lines between what you might call the bulk market and the premium markets. So all of this collectively is having lots of different effects. Some of them very good, some are very beneficial. Indeed, some of the software we now work with is fantastic and it's come on leaps and bounds. But then again, there are some negative effects, of course.
Now let's talk about post-editing. And pricing. I mean, for now, I haven't really kind of put you on the spot in terms of, well, what's the rate, right? I mean, we all know it really depends on domain and volumes, etc. But like it used to be, you know, anywhere between whatever 5, 6, 7, 8 cents and like 15, 20 cents per word. But maybe not. Let's not dwell too much on the word price right now. Have you seen also a shift towards, now we just talked about these disruptors in post-editing, towards hourly pricing? Has that come up in your research? Because it's very, I think it's still hard to price post-editing by word. So I think we should probably move towards maybe more of an hourly pricing. What's your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think over the last few years, I've seen that mentioned more and more, not just in the context of post-editing, but in that context, definitely, you know, translators saying we should be moving to hourly models. So it's common theme to hear people say that post-editing can go from a really smooth, easy process to being horrendous, and it would have been easier or quicker to do it, you know, from scratch rather than editing. So I think that shows that kind of the per word rate is an imperfect way to calculate what's going on. Linked to that, in sort of the translation studies literature, there's quite a lot of voices saying that the rise of post editing, which I mean is massive now, it's leading to lower rates, and so maybe this shift in pricing model could help to combat that as well. I think there's good cause to say that it would be a positive move for the industry, really.
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo that as well. There has been a sustained push, certainly on the translator side, for hourly rates. On a slightly related topic, I had an interesting discussion with my students about this recently, which really helped to highlight to me how poor per word rates can be as a sort of proxy for time. So in one of our simulated projects, the students had priced up a project, and they were charging different hourly rates for different services. So revision had one rate and proofreading had a different hourly rate. And I said to them, why have you done this? And they said, oh, it's because proofreading's quicker and it's not as complicated. I mean, that issue aside, let's forget that for a second. I said to them, well, actually, no, because an hour of your time is worth an hour of your time. It doesn't matter what you're doing. It could be translating, it could be revision, it could be proofreading. It's still an hour of your time. And I think this is the problem that the per word rates show. They are a poor proxy for time. We're supposed to sort of work out how much we can do within a day, divide by number of hours, etc., and you end up with a per word rate, effectively. But when you have the different levels of post editing, so light and full, and then you have all these other services like revision, review, proofreading, it just doesn't work. Per word doesn't work because it's very contingent upon what's actually put in front of you. In terms of whether this is achievable, there's going to be a lot of pushback, I think, because it's very convenient to use per word rates. It's very hard to predict how many hours something will take. So it would have to completely change the way that we price our projects.
I think some like players are a little further along that road than others, depending on the type of texts that they do, right? It's hard because clients want to have that control. They know in advance how much something's going to cost, right? Other than like rather than trusting that, well, I need that particular output and it might be, 10, it might be 50, it might be 20 in terms of the cost. Let me run a theory that we have here at Slater past you. So as machine translation gets better and better and better, and it does, right? I'm a native German speaker. I keep checking in on DeepL, and sometimes I'm like, whoa, okay, that was a couple of paragraphs. I mean, there's some nice old school German words DeepL is using here, and it really doesn't sound even translationese anymore. But of course, over kind of a 5 or 6 paragraphs, there's still a number of issues with the text. But as it becomes ever more high quality, we argue that like the expertise required of a professional linguist to add value to that high quality translation becomes ever higher too, or you just there's the expertise, the demands are higher and higher. So eventually you could argue that rates should reflect that in terms of if you bring that type of domain expertise, you bring that type of linguistic expertise, and you're willing to work as a post editor, essentially, you can command quite a high rate. What are your thoughts on that? That's a theory I've been kind of thinking about for the past couple of years.
I really like the theory, and I think it's undeniable the MT quality is up there. I mean, I work in French primarily as well, and it's good. It's good, that's undeniable. I definitely follow this idea of higher quality from the MT requires higher expertise as well. And I know this from working with students as well, because you see that there's a false sense of security that comes from seeing, oh, this seemingly excellent MT output. And it requires a different kind of competence. It's not just getting something that looks right, it's getting something that's actually functioning in the way that it should as well. And it requires a different kind of competence on their part to spot how and where they need to make the changes. I'd like to think that it will result in higher rates eventually. That would be nice. That's kind of what we're doing all this for. That's what the end goal is. I think these questions of status, this question of perceptions of translation, this inability of translators to kind of signal how much value they're adding, at least now, it's still really tricky hurdles to overcome. But I love the theory.
Yeah, I'd say as well that there has to be a corresponding improvement in the understanding of translate. Again, I come back to this client education side of things. As machine translation improves, translation starts to risk appearing easier, so to speak, as a job. So really it's about clarifying the distinction between the bulk market and the premium market. If you want a cheap, fast, vaguely functional translation and there's no high stakes involved, by all means go down this route. But if there's high stakes involved, or quality is really important, this is very public facing and it reflects on your image as a company, then you have to go down the professional route. MT is fit for purpose in some contexts but not in others. And so, like Joseph was saying, you need increasingly high skilled translators to not only spot those problems during post editing, for example, but increasingly specialized translators in specialist domains as well. And in theory, yes, that should command higher rates. But unfortunately, again, when we're dealing with market forces, it's a question of whether the market is willing to pay for those rates. Yeah, it's a difficult question. Good one, though.
When I, 20 years ago, did my translation studies, I mean, MT was nowhere. So there was no question that we'd obviously add that we'd be able to improve on machine translation. How is it now? Like for you, when you're teaching your students, is it immediate? Can they basically immediately improve on almost any machine translation output by just looking at it? Or are there certain areas where you're like, well, they'd struggle, like if you do blind testing or anything like that?
I think definitely at undergrad level, when they're still learning the languages, I have a lot of students where, the machine translation is just, they'll put their unwavering faith in it, unfortunately. At postgrad level, they tend to be a bit more wary, and they're very good. I mean, I had a student yesterday I was talking to working in Chinese and English who's sort of spotted a published translation. They think it's been machine translated because of certain really subtle cues in there. So that's really good to see. But for more common language pairs for certain domains as well, I think it is becoming tricky. And like you say, yeah, even 10 years ago, the machine translation was comical. It was something we laughed about, and now it's like, oh wait, this is good. And in the classroom, Callum may back me up, or he may have a different story, but there's always that question of, are we going to be replaced? And we have this this difficult balancing act of reassuring students, but being realistic about the industry as well. It's here to stay. It is getting better. It's going to keep improving, and it's impacted upon the way that we work already, and that's not going to stop. We just need to sort of think about how we engage with it.
I mean, that's exactly the same sorts of conversations we have as well. And the going back to the sort of specifics of things that you see students doing, what I've started to recognise is that students are starting to pick up on the types of mistakes it will make. So they almost sort of build up for their own language pair. For those that are doing multiple language pairs, it's more obvious. They can almost say, right, I'm working from Japanese into English now. It's going to make these sorts of errors. So they can be on the lookout for those. And then when they switch into their second language pair, Spanish into English, it makes a totally different set of errors. So it's sort of training them in a very different way. The core skill is still there, and it's based on kind of traditional translation, but the way that it manifests itself is quite interesting, and the way that they actually implement this in the classroom, they're very clearly and very easily adapting to this.
The pay and rate discussion, is this something that is kind of front and center of your your course at university, or is it something that maybe like in the final semester, the final couple of months before graduation becomes a quick afternoon topic? Or like how do you educate your students on that, and at what point does it become a relevant discussion?
One of the main ways we do this at Leeds, for example, is through what you might call simulated translation bureau type modules. And more programs are bringing these in to make sure that the classroom's got the realistic experience. So really, you have a certain number as project managers, a certain number as the vendors, and you give them texts and they work on it. You as the lecturer are the client, and you can be demanding with them and say, no, we've got this budget. Can you fit this budget? So it simulates the negotiation. It simulates some of the awkward questions that a client might ask. And we do purposely try to be awkward as well to do this. But the reason why is because it's a risk-free environment. So they can make mistakes. They can not deliver the project. They can completely miss chunks of text. And we sort of have these debrief sessions where we go through, we talk about rates, we talk about things that could have been done better. And we sort of encourage them to do the research and to negotiate on that front. Joseph, anything you would add there?
I think what I'd add is you're very good at Leeds as well, and based on my experience, we need to talk about rates more as well. It's kind of there, and I try to put it in all my classes, so it's always there in things I teach. When I'm teaching on ethics, we'll talk about the rates of price setting, for instance. It's not just in practical modules. But really, in kind of the translation studies literature, I mean, in our paper, we sort of do a bit of a literature review of things that are talking about, books, textbook, articles that are talking about rates. And the main takeaway that we got is that it's difficult to find concrete information there, so there needs to be more. I mean, it's understandable to a degree. It's very difficult to make blanket statements, and I think Florian, you alluded to this before. The classic translator's answer, "It depends," applies really nicely in the case of rates. But it's such an important area. It's one that I think we need to tackle more and embed more deeply within the university system. So that the very future of the translation industry depends on us having these conversations now. It's also worth noting, I think, at this point that within the universities, we're only reaching a very small proportion of budding translators as well. So. I can't remember what the figures are, but it's something like 25% of translators actually have a degree in translation. That could be way off, by the way, Callum. If you know the figure, correct me. But the point is that the point is that we're not reaching everyone. So this needs to happen on a different level. We need to do more within the universities. Undoubtedly, we can influence practices among translators. That's what we're aiming to do. We can have conversations with industry bodies like yourself. We can talk to associations as well. But we're not reaching everyone, so it needs to go further to elicit this change.
Just one final thing I would add as well is, even though we would have these conversations in classes, I think it's still really important as well that we don't undermine the importance of sort of independent research into rates, because the students will need to negotiate this themselves. They need to listen to the market, the specific niche that they are in a specific domain, a specific language pair, in a specific country from which they operate. So it's a balancing act between giving them an idea of what's realistic, but also not telling them you should charge X per word. It's a delicate balance.
This is so true, Cal. I mean, we struggle with this at Slater. We've been struggling with this ever since we went live in 2015. So our first valiant attempt was we went to the GSA, like the US, I don't know, kind of government procurement agency. We downloaded literally all of the contracts that they had with the LSPs, and then we did like a blended average rate across all of the languages and all of the combinations. And so I think back in the day, it was like 21 cents per word, right? And then you could argue like for the freelancer, I guess it would have been like around 11 or 12 or 13, right? If you look at the margins that the LSPs would make. We got a lot of pushback on that piece of research. It was like, oh, but no, you can't blend the languages, and this is special case here and special case there. So for anybody listening to this, they might also like, well, okay, we're talking about rates, but you're not talking about the rates, right? But it's just so hard to do. Like, yeah, we could say it's 10 cents or it's 15, but then somebody comes around and says, well, but it's a legal piece that takes twice the time. And so I think you wouldn't, as you just put it, Cal, you don't do anybody a favor if you just kind of throw out, this is the rate and you should charge that, because you might be completely uncompetitive with that rate in one scenario and way too low in another one, right? So I guess giving the tools to assess the situation is probably more useful for anybody, for the students as well.
The other factor as well is in a lot of jurisdictions, of course, price fixing is illegal. So any concerted effort to say we should all charge a minimum of X is not allowed. So that's the other problem of saying you should be charging X.
Yeah, and the ATA got in trouble a while ago, and I think the ITI have said they're not going near rates to the same degree because of price fixing concerns. So we've got to be careful with that as well. Telling the students charge this is all well and good until we get in legal trouble with them, isn't it?
All right. Hey, so kind of on paper, the primary focus of your research paper was on the UK, but I think as we just found out now, I think it's very broadly applicable. But like, do you feel there's certain parts that you would kind of caution are mostly around UK, or do you feel like everything that you wrote is broadly applicable?
If I could start, I think we focused on the UK predominantly because it's what we know best. That's the market we've operated in. It's the market we now teach towards, I suppose. But we also do know from our research that a lot of countries elsewhere, I mean, Denmark and Finland come to mind, the situation is, or at least it seems better. There seems to be better protection for the professionals and sort of regulation or quasi-regulation. And even in sort of mainland Europe and the US, I believe, sworn translators, sworn interpreters they're a protected class of professionals. There are barriers to entry. In the UK, there are minimal barriers. I think Joseph said this earlier. In the UK, you can basically say one day, I'm a translator, and you can start working as a translator. So that's one of the reasons for the UK focus. Joseph, was there anything you'd add there?
That's very true, and it was very sensible of us to stick to the UK because it is what we know best. But at the same time, from conversations we've had with colleagues in universities, with translators, with students as well, people from countries all around the world, we are seeing that there are a number of shared experiences there. So the arguments that we make are definitely not exclusive to the UK, and this kind of marginal status, these challenges, these concerns in terms of pay, do extend well beyond the UK. And I mean, these disruptive trends that we mentioned as well, so the changing technology, that's causing the same pressures everywhere. So it's something that we think applies a bit more widely, but there are distinct challenges that pop up in all these cases, and so we can't just make blanket statements with any kind of confidence there. But yeah, hopefully there are insights that other people can take, and maybe this research could be extended in other geographic contexts as well.
I think it should be. So to close, what piece of advice would you give to, or are you giving rather, to your graduate students entering the industry? We don't have to make this a hypothetical. This is a very concrete question.
So the first one, again, we sort of had a bit of a brainstorm on this, and again came up with fairly similar answers. So the first one that we both definitely agreed on was networking. And I think this is really important because, to be completely honest, freelance translation, it can be a lonely enterprise at times. And so that social element is really important. I recently went to the ITI conference in Brighton, and it was a fantastic event. There were several hundred people attended, great talks, got to meet loads of really interesting people. But from a business perspective, word of mouth is a really good source for work. Just 1 week, your friend working in the same language pair, the same domain, he or she might not be available, but he or she says to the LSP, I know someone, let me put you in touch, and so on. So these sorts of connections are really good. And especially if you network with more experienced translators, the question of rates is something you can discuss with them, as well as other more general questions relating to professional practices. Joseph, what was next on our list?
I'm going to stick with networking for a second, just to say that we've said translation is so diverse, all the different subject areas, the different languages, different contexts that we're working in. And I think this is another reason that networking is so important, because you can find people who've gone through similar challenges to you, who are working in similar domains as well. In translator education, it's got to be more kind of holistic. We can't necessarily speak to every single niche, so I think the network is important there. And you kind of got towards what I was going to go towards there, Callum. We need to talk about rates more. That's something that I say to students in this context, let's try and break the taboo and have these discussions. Obviously, avoid price fixing. We don't want to go down that road, but we need to discuss these issues more. To make this change happen, there need to be open conversations there.
I think the final sort of third one that I think we amalgamated a few things into this really is just don't stop learning. So CPD is obviously really important, and especially if you go join associations, CPD is something that they really champion on a regular basis to keep up with language skills, your domain, business skills even, additional qualifications, diplomas, just reading in the relevant languages, in the relevant domains. And the other thing to bear in mind is that by staying in touch with these developments, it's a way to protect yourself. So just because there's work there today, don't assume that you'll be safe tomorrow. And I know that has a slightly negative tone to it, but it's a fast changing industry, and you basically need to make sure that you're on top of your game at all the time.
100%. Great final words. So thanks so much, Callum. Thanks, Joseph, for joining us today at SlaterPod.